Episode 1. Welcome to Gallita. It was a stunningly beautiful Galician day as a horse-drawn buggy made its way sluggishly down the country dirt road. Raptors soared high in the cloudless sky, loosing piercing screeches of joy while they scoured for prey. A gentle breeze frolicked among the tall grasses and tussled in the tree branches. This particular dirt road meandered its way along the basin of a long and wide valley, as straight as a seldom used road could hope to be, though, curiously, far better maintained than it had any right to be. The buggy, more of a cart than a buggy really, but Linrem did insist that it was indeed a buggy, bounced along merrily with its passengers and cargo in tow. Linrem, a pale-skinned fellow well advanced into his late years, sat in the driver's seat and cooed encouragement to the donkey that pulled the buggy, along the sun-baked road. In the back, sitting cross-legged amongst the barrels and boxes of goods, eyes glued shut and face scrunched in concentration, was Rabineau, a boy of 16, almost a man really, he would say. Rabineau was a bit of an oddity. Unlike the vast majority of children his age, Rabineau was short. He was a loner. He talked to animals. He liked it better when they couldn't talk back. And, perhaps most peculiar of all, he was acutely tuned to will magic, and had a well far deeper than even his master, Linrem, possessed. Rabineau's smooth, dark skin shone with sweat as he sat in the midday sun, furiously attempting to meditate.
"That's it now, Slippy,"
Linrem cooed from the driver's seat.
"Atta girl. Nice and easy does it."
"Master," Rabineau cracked an eye and regarded the back of the old man, "could you please keep the conversation to a minimum?"
"Nonsense, my boy,"
Linrem shouted without even glancing back.
"How can you hope to cast in the cacophony if you can't meditate in the maelstrom?"
"Must you always spout such gibberish?" The old man touched 2 fingers to his forehead in a swift motion, and suddenly 3 juggler's balls were orbiting Rabineau's head while periodically dive-bombing his face. Linrem shot a devious grin back at Rabineau.
"How's that for gibberish, boy?"
"You're only proving my point." Rabineau closed his eyes once more, ignoring the soft balls now ricocketing off of him.
"And you're only proving mine."
Irritated, Rabineau swatted at the balls, but they deftly dodged his hands, as they always did. There was only ever one way to get the balls to stop. Taking a deep breath, Rabineau reached within himself and tapped into the well nestled in the heart of his soul. Drawing upon the power, Rabineau touched 2 fingers to his forehead, and the balls simply fell out of the air, like a puppet with its strings cut. He grabbed for the balls as they fell to return fire, but Linrem was far too quick. He was always too quick. The balls vanished nearly as soon as Rabineau cut the wheel strings that held them aloft. Linrem chuckled.
"One of these days,"
he waggled a gnarled finger at the sky.
"you'll be fast enough, my boy."
He paused, and the gnarled old finger swirled majestically, producing one of the juggler's balls from thin air.
"But not today."
Rabineau sighed deeply, peeved, and attempted to go back to meditating as the eccentric old man cackled and conversed with the donkey, who never talked back, as far as Rabineau knew. In truth, the crazy old codger was the closest thing he had to family. Rabineau was orphaned as a child and struggled to survive on the streets of Ohangpur, the capital of Gallita, until a chance encounter put his 6-year-old hand into Linrem's pocket at exactly the wrong time. Though the more Rabineau learned of the brilliant will mage, the more he realized he would have never been able to pick his pocket.
"You're not trying hard enough,"
Linrem chided from the driver's seat without turning around. Rabineau scowled and took another deep breath to clear his mind. He hated it when the old man did that. It was like he was keenly aware of every thought that rolled lazily through Rabineau's brain. Focusing, this time, Rabineau did it correctly. Relaxing his body and extending his mind, he opened his third eye to find himself in a room. The room was small, nondescript, unimportant. What was important was a perfectly round hole in the middle of the floor. Rabineau examined the hole as he always did when entering this place. The hole, he knew, was the mouth of his well, the internal store of his own power. Rabineau flexed his will and felt the well tremble beneath him. He did not tap into it like he would if he were attempting to cast, diving in and reveling in his own power. Instead, he merely flexed it, feeling out the bonds of his well without sinking beneath the surface. This was how Linrem had taught him to strengthen his well.
When a person is born, their well has a set depth, as everyone's does, and it stays at that depth for their entire life,
Linrem had explained all those years ago.
However, just because our wells have a limit in terms of depth does not, in fact, mean their bounds are limited in terms of width. For example,
he had produced 2 items at that point, a tall glass cup and a vase that was just as tall as the cup, but far wider near the base.
Do these 2 items hold the same amount of water?
No, master, Rabineau had said quickly. They do not.
And yet,
the old man had continued with a twinkle in his eye,
these 2 items could be a fair representation of a single person's well over the course of their life.
How could it be the glass and the vase? Linrem flicked a finger, and the water in the glass decided to go flying across the room to splash across Rabineau's face.
Were you not paying attention? I said over the course of their life.
Okay, Rabineau said, wiping his face with the back of his sleeve. So you're saying it's like every other muscle in the body. The more you use it, the stronger it gets?
To a degree,
Linrem said, stroking his wispy beard pensively.
If overworking and straining said muscle killed you,
Rabineau frowned. What do you mean?
This is will magic, boy,
Linrem scowled.
Any misstep or miscalculation will cost you your life. Why do you think wheel magic is still so stigmatized?
I just thought it was really difficult to use, Rabineau had answered.
No!
Linrem had sobered in that moment and become the most serious Rabineau had ever seen him before or since.
This is very important, son, so listen carefully. If you do not have enough will to fulfill your casting, the casting takes your life force instead.
What? Rabineau had looked stricken. But how do you know how much will a casting will take? Linrem grinned, the twinkle returning to his eye.
And just like that, you have hit upon the crux of will magic, Rabbit. There is no way to tell how much will a casting will take until it is released. Will magic is attuned to your every desire, and thus has a tendency to react in unexpected ways.
I really wish you would stop calling me Rabbit, Rabineau had said, peeved.
Really?
Linrem mused.
But it's the best compliment that I can come up with. You're quick, cunning, and despite being at the bottom of the food chain, you show a tenacity that is unshakable.
So it has nothing to do with the fact that I'm short and you like poking fun at me?
What?
His feigned shock was a little too on the nose.
I would never!
Rabineau crossed his arms and glared.
Besides,
Linrem had continued with a grin, you're far more adorable than the average rabbit. Rabineau was torn from his memories as Linrem started calling for Skippy to slow, in turn causing the buggy to sluggishly lose momentum. Opening his eyes and looking around, Rabineau saw the change in speed was due to the fact that the buggy was arriving at Twilight Chateau, Linrem's home and base of operations. A neat collection of earth-colored buildings rose from the ground in a gentle swirl that Linrem called a Fibonacci. though Rabineau had entirely tuned out when the old eccentric man had begun explaining. The center of the swirl had the smallest of the buildings, little more than a door set into a tiny hut. This was the entrance to the bulk of Linrim's home and workshop, which lay underground. A massive complex vastly larger than the entirety of the buildings above ground. The collection of buildings above held aspects of the workshop that could not be feasibly kept below, like the stable, the smithy, and the always locked and forever odd-smelling alchemy storeroom.
You act as you have never laid eyes upon the place, Linrim chided, without looking back as always. Did I not tell you to meditate?
Rabineau scowled. I was doing it just fine.
Oh, you were? Linrim cooed. Looked to me like you were gawking.
You distracted me. Linrim tutted and shook his head.
You must not allow any interference when interacting with your well.
I know, Rabineau said, irritated.
Apparently not well enough.
Linrim shot back, his tone edging upon dangerous.
You'll be doing the pinwheel to make up for your lack of effort.
Linrim turned in his seat, making eye contact with Rabineau and brooking no argument.
You toy with magic that would just as soon take your life as it would bend to your will. No excuses, Rabbit. You want to be a will mage? You want to be the best? Quit screwing around.
Linrim finished chastising Rabineau just as the buggy closed the remaining distance to the gates, which opened to receive them. Gareth, Linrim's servant, a man that was more ancient than even Linrim, if that were possible, came out to meet them. The stooped old man took the reins from Linrim and proffered a hand to assist his master's dismount. Linrim scoffed at Gareth and jumped down from the buggy with no help, like a man far younger than he was. Linrim looked back at Rabineau and jerked his head towards the old servant.
Assist Gareth in tending to Slippy before you begin the pinwheel.
Linrim looked at Gareth.
Make sure he does most of the work, old man. I don't need you croaking over a pitchfork of hay.
Of course, master. Gareth inclined his head in a bow. I wouldn't dream of it, sir. Linrim looked back at Rabineau with a twinkle in his eye.
At least someone can follow directions around here.
Hours later, Rabineau stood trembling, dripping sweat on a narrow lip that ran along the edge of the stable's roof. He had a pole balanced across his shoulders, and each end held a bucket with water sloshing around inside of it. The pinwheel, as Linrim had lovingly named it, was an exercise in which Rabineau climbed atop the buildings of the chateau, starting in the middle, and walked along a specially raised rail that circled around the entire complex, all while balancing that pole and the buckets of water across his shoulders. If he fell or lost one of the buckets, he had to start over, and Rabineau was terrible at it. Even now, after having done the grueling exercise more times than he dreaded to count, he still couldn't get halfway without the wind grabbing at one of the buckets and wrecking his balance. And of course, due to the nature of the Fibonacci, the buildings of the chateau got progressively larger as they swirled out, putting the entire rail Rabineau walked at a cruel incline, made brutally worse because it wasn't even as wide as one of his feet, making finding purchase far more difficult. Nearly 11 years, Rabineau had been apprenticed to the crazy old mage, and not one single time had he been able to complete the pinwheel. Rabineau tightened his screaming abdomen muscles and tried to focus on keeping his breathing level as a breeze came tickling along his spine, threatening to pick up and cause him problems. Finding his center, he calmly slid a foot forward, transferring his weight and sliding the other foot to meet it. This slow shuffle was the surest way Rabineau had found to progress along the rail. If he tried to step foot over foot, the wind was far likelier to pull at him and steal his precious balance. So he never let his feet leave the rail, shuffling foot by agonizing foot. Rabineau had fallen twice already. The second time had been nearly where he was now, and his body throbbed in memory from the impact. Of course, the further along he progressed, the further he had to fall when he failed. And Rabino always failed. His heart skipped a beat as he shuffled past the spot where he had fallen previously, feeling accomplished at making it further. A grin started tugging at the corner of Rabino's mouth, his confidence soaring. And then, as it always seemed to happen, a rogue gust of wind picked up and yanked at the bucket that hung over the abyss, hard. Though Rabino was more than used to this exact event happening, he had yet to find a way to counter it. With a yelp, Rabino went plunging over the side of the building. Rabino threw his arms over his face to brace for impact, but just before he collided with the ground, it felt as if the air had turned into a giant cushion, gently cradling him and slowing his fall until it deposited him on the ground with no more force than one would use in laying a babe in their cradle. The pole and buckets landed just as serenely a short distance away. Not a drop had been spilt.
Now that would have been quite the fall,
Linram cackled gleefully. The old man sat perched on a crate several feet from where Rabino had landed.
See, what you did wrong there,
He leaned forward with a mad grin on his face.
was you fell.
He rocked backwards, laughing raucously. Rabino groaned as he sat up, rubbing his sore hip from where he had landed the last time. Such sagely advice as always, master.
Oh, don't be a sodden shoe, the old man giggled. From where I'm sitting, that was quite amusing.
I'm glad you take such joy in my misery, master. Rabino gave him a wry smile, though it would have been nice had you caught me the other times I fell.
What's the fun in that?
Linram asked blankly.
Besides, how else would you learn a lesson,
Rabino opened his mouth to retort, but the eccentric mage waved a hand at the air and cut him off.
That's enough for now. Come.
He clambered off of the crate and began walking towards the house without waiting to see if Rabino followed. Of course he did.
We have lessons to pertain to, my young apprentice.
Linram led Rabino through the door in the center structure and down the spiral staircase held within. The pair walked on in silence until they reached Linram's study, a towering room lined with bookshelves crammed to bursting with books and scrolls of every type, in languages living and many that were long since forgotten. In the middle of the room, a large, impressive oak desk stood imposingly over a much smaller table and chair that stood across from it. Linram took his place in the magnificent armchair behind the oak desk, as Rabino took his in the apprentice desk facing it. Rabino sat in silence as the old man produced a pipe from one of the drawers and lit it with the tip of his index finger, in a casting Rabino had yet to figure out. Linram puffed on the pipe stoically, regarding the room around him before letting his gaze fall upon his pupil.
Tell me, apprentice,
he said as smoke curled from his lips.
What are the tenets of will magic?
Will magic cannot be exerted over those that have will of their own, Rabino began.
Good,
Linram nodded.
Next.
To cast will magic, one must engage or tap one's will, Rabino continued, which each person has within them and contains their will, or the very energy produced by our souls. Linram nodded in approval, and Rabino went on. If one does not have enough will in their well when they release their casting, the magic will instead pull from their very life force, killing the caster and failing the casting in the process.
Very good,
Linram said.
But it is also important to note that the casting does not always fail in this scenario, though it often does. It is also possible that the casting could act in unforeseeable and likely lethal ways. If you're ever present when a will mage fails their casting, I recommend you get as far away as possible as quickly as you can.
Rabino nodded and shivered at the thought. When Limrim said nothing more, he went on. There is absolutely no way of knowing how much will a casting requires until it is cast. Limrim nodded grimly.
Perhaps the most lethal aspect of will magic. Why?
Because will is not something that can be measured, Rabineau answered. Each casting is unique, dependent on many variables, including the caster's intent and fortitude. The same casting could cost two different mages entirely different amounts of their will. Will
is fickle, Limrim added. Emotions can enhance or hinder. Even the weather could impact your casting. That is precisely why will magic is so shunned. No one wishes to take the time to know themselves. Therefore, they all fear the whiplash.
Is it that simple, Master? Rabineau asked. Is knowing yourself the key to successful will magic? Limrim stared at his apprentice for a long moment, then burst into laughter.
You search for the key as if there were only one!
What do you mean? Rabineau asked, frowning.
Knowing yourself, for starters, is one hell of a task,
Limrim answered.
We are not fixed creatures, Rabbit. We change every day of our lives in the most imperceptible ways. To know yourself, you have to be in tune with every ebb and flow, and that's on top of understanding your own being, your nature. This alone is a task so monumental that most look at it as impassable.
Do you know yourself, Master? Limrim cackled softly.
Better than most, not as well as some. I can be a slippery devil to keep track of at times.
Rabineau cocked his head and opened his mouth to reply, but his master cut him off with a wave of his hand.
Not important. Continue.
Rabineau pursed his lips and nodded. Will magic, when successfully cast, emits shock waves that those attuned to will magic can feel. Limrim fluttered his hands out before him. Like butterfly wings displacing air with every beat. He looked at Rabineau.
So what does this mean?
It means that when you cast will magic, Rabineau replied, other mages will be able to track down the exact spot where the casting occurred.
Exactly,
Limrim nodded.
Making every casting a beacon for those that wish us ill.
I don't understand, Master, Rabineau said, scrunching his face in thought. Why would anyone wish us ill?
Don't be a fool, boy,
Limrim scoffed.
People fear what they do not understand, and that fear makes them dangerous. Others would see our abilities as tools to be manipulated or competition to be silenced.
Are there truly that many attuned to will magic?
Limrim scoffed. Oh, hells no, he chuckled. Only maybe 1 in 100 people can even feel the reverberations will casting emits. And of those, an even smaller percentage would be able to triangulate the source of the casting.
Rabineau perked his head. Then why make such a big deal of it? Limrim leaned forward, all mirth gone from his face.
Because of those that can track down the source of a will casting, most are to be dealt with extreme caution.
Rabineau nodded, but said nothing more. Limrim stared a moment longer before leaning back and motioning with his hand.
Continue.
Rabineau took a deep breath and fidgeted in his seat, uncomfortable under his master's scrutiny. 3 things are needed in will casting. 1, you must tap into your well. 2, you must have a clear and concise goal or object in mind. And 3, you must make a physical connection between your will and the world, usually accomplished by touching your forehead where the third eye and the source of our will magic sits. Limrim nodded slowly, observing his pupil.
Good. Well done, Rabbit.
The old man got up from his chair and began pacing slowly behind it, stroking his beard pensively as he went.
Due to the perilously dangerous nature of will magic, he began, the hallmark of good will mage is knowing when casting is appropriate. The hallmark of the best is knowing when it is appropriate and casting anyway. The key, he turned and regarded Rabineau, is to work your will in nearly imperceptible ways. In order to move a mountain, start with a single pebble. As if to emphasize this colloquialism, he tossed something small into the air. Rabineau didn't see what it was until it landed softly in his lap. Looking down, he saw it was a small, round pebble, smooth and flawless. That concludes our lessons for today, Linram said stoically. You may adjourn to your room for private studies.
And that concludes episode 1 of Rabineau, Wizard Extraordinaire.